Welcome to Classes in Session, presented by UI Health. I'm Doug Glanville. After the season ends, we start a new one, a finer-tuned version composed of the best teams and athletes that met the criteria of entering the next round. Teams may have had the right free agent signing. Tennis stars may have fired the right coach. They learned from last year, and now they are destined to be champions. The way to find the best, the ones that rose out of all the storylines and excuses that dot the journey, is to create a format that separates the great from the rest. It must find the greatest, the one and the only. Each system will then claim to be the purest form to determine who earned the title of champion in their respective sports. Then the next year, new candidates will arise, those that rebuilt and reloaded to meet their moments, and the structure may be revamped. Money is a driver, put on the scale to steer the path of a champion. So are we finding the best, or is the best just an outgrowth of what is most profitable? We will discuss this with Amin, voice of the Chicago Bulls as well as Fox Sports, where he does play-by-play for both the NFL and MLB. Roxy Bernstein, play-by-play voice who has called MLB, college sports, NHL, and more, also my partner for Major League Baseball on ESPN Radio. And Owen Poindexter, senior writer for Front Office Sports. Let's get to class. No matter the sports stage, athletes and teams can claim they are number one, even if the comparison is only to the team across the field. We obsess with rankings and top 10 lists. They drive prestige, and at the highest level of any sport, an economy. Winners win on the field, and then they win off the field. And we will always have an intense curiosity for finding the best when the smoke clears. So we have engineered ways to create the ultimate obstacle course to find out. Some ways use point systems. Others rely on massive tournament play. Still others employ seeding structures that celebrate a battle of enduring wills. We call them quarterfinals or round of 16s, division series or wild cards. They are sweet and elite, final and qualifying. In the end, someone or some team is crowned champion, the best, the one that is left standing. It is important to note that change has become an inherent part of playoff systems. Teams are added, rules are amended, and often that change is to maximize the profitability of the process. The more teams that can qualify for a playoff system, the more power it has to ignite more fan bases, the simple chance to win. And the institutions win because they will have more high-stakes games that come with television rights and licensing fees. It is a bonanza, and matters not if your team barely had more wins than losses. They can be the Cinderella story that shows how we should always believe in the impossible. Trapped in a constantly expanding playoff net is concern for celebrating mediocrity and the nullification for whatever the regular season was supposed to mean. Baseball plays 162 games in its season, and with more teams allowed in, the regular season becomes more of a seeding mechanism than an indicator of the inevitable victory of the team with the most wins. We have a deep need to see the impossible happen. The 16th seed beats the number 1 seed. The teen phenom who wipes the floor with the crafty veteran who has more trophies in storage than in her trophy case. We instantly find meaning in our lives since we are all underdogs in our own narrative, fighting against the odds when no one believed in us. Every postseason, we are reminded of this truth. The playoffs also show us what number 1 looks like in real time. We watch history be written, heroes forged. We see names get etched on the side of shiny treasures. It connects us to the past instantaneously through direct comparison and statistical compilation. Then we could say we made history. We could even say we wrote it. And we could write that history with the hand that is inside the foam number 1 finger. Meanwhile, the other hand can be writing a check. More teams, more merch, more money. There are many ways to find a champion, but money has to win too in order to even have a next season. Very fortunate to have our panel of guests here on Classes in Session. We have Amin, a voice of Fox Sports, play-by-play, also the Chicago Bulls, very comprehensive experience with MLB and the NFL. So Adam, welcome.
Thank you so much, Doug.
And we have my colleague at ESPN, Roxy Bernstein. I call him the Swiss Army knife of play-by-play. He's done NHL, he's done college sports, MLB. The man is everywhere. We have Roxy Bernstein and a big Cal fan, so we got to get that in there.
You got to get a plug in there for the alma mater, don't you? Good to be here.
So gentlemen, really appreciate your expertise as we are discussing playoff formats. And, we're seeing a lot of change, whether it's conference realignment or the fact that, more teams are getting added to all these postseason. And so you're the voices of these teams. You're telling the stories. So I just want to start off at like the fundamental level. Do you think the playoffs actually crown the best? And I guess why or why not? And I'll start with you, Adam.
I think that the systems themselves are built to reward teams that are quote unquote the best. And I think the first thing you have to do is define what you see as the best. I do think that the current system in place for most North American team sports certainly is built to reward a team that can sustain success for the longest period of time. And if that's a good definition of the best team, then yes, I think overall the system is geared towards it. I don't think the playoff systems are inherently based, though, on crowning the best team or crowning the best player necessarily. I think the structure is in place to try to reward teams that have a longer period of sustained success in the regular season and to give them as much of an advantage as possible within the structures and confines that we've given them to try to show that they indeed are the best team.
And in some sports, Doug, for example, it comes down to who's the healthiest, right? When you're getting toward the end of a playoff run. For example, look at the NFL last year, where the 49ers were essentially without a quarterback in the NFC Championship game. Who knows if they would have beaten Philadelphia had they had a healthy Brock Purdy or even a capable backup.
Well, and that sort of leads me to like thinking about expansion, right? Because what you're often kind of referring to is the fact that, baseball has added wild card teams. And the trade-off is like, okay, you have fan bases that now are more excited. They're in it, so to speak. But there's also this balance of like dilution.
I think it's important to recognize that within these different sports, there are slightly different structures, but the results seemingly are the same in terms of fan engagement. I've been watching the NBA expand its playoff over the course of the last couple of years. And I do feel like in basketball, it's helped fan bases stay engaged, even if it's not the same engagement that a fan base would typically want, right? A fan base wants its team to be fighting for a number one seed or to be comfortably in a playoff position and trying to hope that they get the best matchup. Whereas when you're in the 7 through 10 now in the NBA in a particular conference, you're fighting for a play-in tournament spot. I wonder sometimes if it's a framing problem, if it's a narrative problem that we're creating rather than an actual structural issue that we're dealing with. Because a story like the Miami Heat last year should be one of the best stories in sports, and it was for a lot of people. But because of the NBA product during the regular season, because of how it's been kind of created, this narrative that the regular season doesn't have as much value anymore, it's harder to sell that tale.
Yeah, and Rox, in light of that, you think about the line that we maybe subconsciously or consciously draw about like who kind of gets in, right? Who can be the Miami Heat, let's say. Is it under 500? 2020 baseball, the pandemic year, there was two teams that made the postseason that were under 500.
Well, I don't know how you would put those parameters on a specific league, right? For example, if you had a team win their division in the NFL at 8 and 9, okay, well, they're not playoff eligible, so we're just going to skip them. We're going to go to somebody else because they're not 500. I don't know how you do that. You lay out the groundwork and the foundation for it before a season. Look, does it make a mockery of the playoffs with a team below 500? When we get to the playoffs in the second season, that's when it really begins. And I know that's kind of the motivation for the NBA and why they're doing this new in-season tournament. And if you look at the college game, for example, whether it's football or basketball, there's a lot of emphasis placed on the regular season because if you don't perform then, you're not getting into the playoffs. You're not getting into the college football playoff or the NCAA tournament. So I don't know how you incorporate the two models in terms of putting more emphasis on the regular season. Baseball, I think there's a significant emphasis on the regular season, where some of the other sports, you can have a quote-unquote mediocre season, but still get into the postseason.
We continue with our in-depth look at the postseason next on Classes in Session with Doug Glanville, presented by UI Health. Welcome back to Classes in Session with Doug Glanville, presented by UI Health, and our conversation with Amin and Roxy Bernstein. So I want to ask you guys about star power. Because we talk about there's a little bit of engineering at times, right, to kind of create these formats. You want a certain amount of teams, the numbers are calculated, the economics are looked at. And then you have the individuality of Shohei Ohtani and Mike Trouts and these great players that maybe choose free agency or sign contracts in certain marketplaces. But there's some players that just don't get to the postseason. What does it mean in how you contextualize, in these games that you're calling, the value of star players to the story? And someone like Shohei Ohtani, who's always on the outside looking in, what are we losing by that scenario, that sort of condition by which Ohtani finds himself in?
I think we're losing the casual baseball fan and appreciating the greatness of a Shohei Ohtani, for example. I mean, how many of the casual baseball fans are tuning in going, I have to find the Angels game tonight, right? I got to watch Ohtani. It's only, the hardcore baseball fan and the Angel fan or whoever the Angels are playing are really dialed in. And it's a shame because what he's doing is historic. We've never seen really at this level. Yes, Babe Ruth did it 80, 90 years ago. But what Ohtani's doing is incredible. And I think when the casual baseball fan tunes in the postseason, that's what they want to see. The casual baseball fan is getting cheated of not seeing Ohtani. And also Mike Trout, because Mike Trout has been in the playoffs once in his entire career. It's unfortunate that's how they're judged, and people will be critical of the Angels, and deservedly so, because the Angels have not been competitive. But that's where I think the game of baseball is cheating itself by not having Shohei Ohtani in the playoffs. Is that the Angels' fault? Maybe. Is that baseball's fault? I don't know how you can blame Major League Baseball, but it certainly hurts the game and the development of the young fan that they're not able to see Shohei Ohtani on baseball's biggest stage.
The reason that the Astros would be a good watch in the World Series because there's familiarity there. They're the closest thing we have to that Yankees dynasty. They're the closest thing we have to, I think, what the New England Patriots were really in the 2000s in the NFL with the Tom Brady, dominance from the 2000s into the 2010s. It's the closest thing we have to that. So I think it's the sports job to be able to market the players that we see. And it's obviously our job as broadcasters that when we're given these stories and given these narratives and given these opportunities on the biggest possible stage where the most amount of viewers are going to be watching these games, it's our job to try to frame these things properly within the structure that we're given.
So, and just like to ask you this kind of final thought question. When you think about nostalgia as someone who's, the keepers of the game, is there a time period, an era that you look back in a playoff scenario that kind of makes you think gosh, I remember that and I kind of wish I had that today?
You had the American League and the National League. The best team at the end of the season out of the American League played the best team out of the National League at the end of the season. And by the way, that will never, ever, 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 ever happen again. And we know that because there's too much money to be made in the current playoff structure, and there's money to be made in expansion as well. And I do think that does speak to the argument of expansion versus dilution. There is a critical mass that you eventually hit, and I think maybe we've already hit that. But to be very nostalgic, that's the ultimate way to determine a champion to me, is to still have a value to the regular season that's so inherently clear to what we see structured that every single game does have a significant amount of value to it. And there is a nostalgia that I have for that. Can you find that in the current structure and the current economic climate? I do think there's probably a balance there, and smarter people or more interested and invested people probably have a better idea as to how to get to that point than maybe the three of us do. But I do think there's something there where you can find a balance and still make money and still not dilute the product and still do something that's better for the sport inherently overall.
I mean, I don't know if it'll ever be better for us than we were kids and watching a potential dynasty. Like, I grew up in the era where the San Francisco 49ers had that 20-year span with all those Super Bowls that they won. And you don't appreciate as a kid. You think it's going to happen like that all the time. And my son's kind of going through that now, living here in the Bay Area, right? Ever since he's been alive, the Golden State Warriors have been a championship contender, have been phenomenal. Yep. He has no idea how crappy they were for 20 years. It's awesome. I love the playoffs. I love getting into it, watching every pitch right now as we're headed toward the World Series. And we remember things, but it's just not the same for us, right? Those teams, when you were young, you idolized those players. You lived and died on every pitch or every play. And now I think we just appreciate it a little bit more and how hard it is for these players to get there and what they're doing on the biggest stage.
Well, gentlemen, I really thank you for your time and your insight on this. It's incredible, shedding so much light on the storytelling aspect of what it means to try to crown a champion and the formats and structures that we're bound by that are constantly evolving. And I think we're certainly more insightful because of it and because of your contribution to the show. So thank you both for your time.
Thanks, Doug.
Thanks, Doug.
Coming up, we follow the money. Does it lead to the promised land for leagues, teams, and fans, or just fill bank accounts? We explore with Owen Poindexter on Classes in Session with Doug Glanville, presented by UI Health. Welcome back to Classes in Session with Doug Glanville, presented by UI Health. Very fortunate to have our next guest, Owen Poindexter, who is a senior writer at Front Office Sports, also host of Front Office Sports Today. And he provides a lot of insight on what we've been talking about, which is about the playoff systems and the structures, the impact on either the profitability of these sports and also the competitive landscape and how we crown champions. So, Owen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks. Great to be here.
I know your expertise, lies so much in sort of the models, these economics and these decision makers at how sport is sort of celebrated. And in many ways, when you talk about playoffs, this is sort of the ultimate jewel, right, of how you find a champion.
Yes.
So I guess on a fundamental level, how profitable are playoffs? The systems itself, why is it important on the economic landscape? And why do we have them in that way? And why are we continually chasing more of the economics of it?
Yeah, well, the playoffs, both on the business side and on the competitive side, are the regular season condensed into a couple weeks. And so there's more interest, you get much bigger audiences, you get more fans, you can sell more merch, everything is amplified. So of course the playoffs are, they're quite profitable. But as you're alluding to, the bigger you make the playoffs, often, or the more teams you bring in, the more arbitrary it becomes. And so you do have this tension of the regular season, especially in baseball.
No, and I really appreciate how you frame that, because we often hear okay, we're adding more teams and we're kind of celebrating mediocrity. We're getting kind of further away. But part of the issue or question that arises is actually what's arbitrary about it. Will we find some threshold in the future that sort of starts to work against the economic viability of the sport?
I think we could get there, but I don't know if we're there yet. And because, now baseball has 12 playoff teams, and I actually think they did a decent job of creating incentives around still trying to achieve in the regular seasons. And I will say that expanded playoffs make the regular season, they usually make it more fun because you have more races, you have more markets, you have more fans who have a chance. You can be in late September and still have almost half the teams thinking, if things break right for us, we're in the playoffs. I think we may reach a point where it's too much. I feel like if MLB added more teams to the playoffs, I think, a lot of us in the media and probably a lot of fans would say, what are we doing here?
Are there any particular models you see in playoffs that you think, have a certain sort of fidelity, integrity that, seems to be structurally sound, like more than others?
Yeah, I mean, that balance is what's tricky. And you look at March Madness, like that is a beloved tournament. People who don't know a thing about college basketball, they'll still fill out a bracket just because it's you can't resist it. It's and there's upsets, and you care about the upsets, even though you don't know either of the schools that, you don't know the 14 that just beat the 3. It's fun, and it's because it's arbitrary. And at the end, you still feel like the Final Four is something close to what the Final Four maybe should have been. But that is a celebration of randomness, and it's very profitable. The NFL has a decent one, actually, because they have that bye system. Home field matters a lot. I think because it makes the regular season matter quite a lot, a dropped pass or a penalty or whatever, you still have that arbitrariness. The NFL is kind of in its own category anyway, because it is such an economic juggernaut.
I'm curious about smaller markets, right? Okay, the macro level, these leagues, but then you always have these interesting places like Green Bay or something like that. Does that play into I guess, sort of the playoff world when you have sort of these smaller markets that are able to still carry such weight.
Yeah, it does. And, I should say all these leagues, they want New York and LA and Chicago. They want the big markets in the playoffs as much as possible. You mentioned Green Bay. I think Green Bay works because it's been there a long time. You can't imagine, you can't remember a time before there was an NFL team in Green Bay. You wouldn't, if they were starting fresh, if they're going to say, okay, let's wipe the Packers off the map and let's put an NFL team somewhere, it would not be in Green Bay. These leagues need their smaller markets because there are only so many big markets to go around. But yeah, you give a truth serum to these executives. Who do they want in the playoffs? Yeah, Yankees versus Dodgers, maybe throw in the Cubs, but a cult following is not going to compete with the population of New York.
Oh, and listen, I want to thank you so much for your time and insight on the playoff and the world, sort of the economics that kind of undergird it in a lot of ways. I mean, there are so many competing interests. I think you've provided so much insight on that to help us understand it better. So I just wanted to thank you for taking the time to join me on the show.
Thanks, Doug. This was a lot of fun.
Behind every championship crown is a team, but also a system created where champions compete for the ultimate prize. The speed of reevaluating these systems is faster than it's ever been, as we reassess its fairness as much as we try to capture the economic upside of adding more teams to the competition. As we look to expand the playoffs with more teams, more money, and more viewers, we tend to look back at how we connected to a team or a sport in the first place. Long-term fans remember when it was more straightforward. No wildcard teams, an annual Goliath versus Goliath with an all-or-nothing backdrop. Win the division or go home. But there were so many markets left on the outside of that world, ones that had something to offer to the celebration of the sport on its biggest stage, from Super Bowls to World Cups. We shunned participation awards, but we did want to see more teams in the race. By having more teams involved in the Tournament of Champions, we reasonably raised the concern of mediocrity creeping in. However, more also allows for randomness and the excitement of arbitrary impact, an aspect that we love about sports, not knowing what is going to happen until it happens. And we will never forget when that happens to our team. I'm Doug Glanville. See you next time.